The Champions Chess Tour finals are taking place in Toronto, Canada this week with 8 top grandmasters participating, fighting for the first place of $200,000, and also Magnus Carlsen, Hikaru Nakamura, they are both present, as well as some other very strong players. In the first round, Magnus Carlsen is playing with the white pieces against the big underdog of this event, Denis Lazavik from Belarus. Only 16 years old, but a very strong grandmaster. Let's have a look what happened in that game, because it's very, very instructive. Make sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so yet. I appreciate all the support, and I promise you will learn something from Magnus Carlsen in this game. Let's see. Magnus goes for 1d4. Knight of 6, c4, e6, knight of 3, d5. Queen's Gambit declined, very well-known line, of course. Knight c3, bishop e7, and here Magnus decides to take on d5. Black recaptures with a pawn, and now the first small surprise of the game, as most people, they develop their bishop to g5 here. It's obviously the most active square where the bishop can go to, but nowadays people also seem to like this move, bishop f4. It's of course a nice active developing move, but it does put less pressure on Black's center. But it's a very interesting move, and it probably doesn't come as a huge surprise to Lazavik, because after the move c6, white goes e3, Magnus had his position b4 with the white pieces. His opponent Erik Hansen played here the move bishop f5, which is one of the main moves, but Lazavik decides to go for this move knight h5, which is probably the best move in the position, as Black is about to get rid of this bishop. The bishop, it's okay, it can be taken, you can recapture, it's not a big deal. The big question though is, how is white going to give its bishop? If bishop would go to e5, then knight d7 is going to be played, and that knight captures on e5 next. So that's not very attractive. If you do go back to g3, then at the right moment the knight will capture the bishop on that square. But queen c2 is Magnus his choice, and that's very interesting. It's the most ambitious move in the position. After knight takes f4, Black is getting the bishop pair, and white is voluntarily weakening its pawn structure. But the question is, are these pawns really weak? Well, the pawn on d4, it's sort of isolated, but together with the pawn on f4, you also get a nice square for your knight on e5 later on. Black played here the move queen d6, attacking the pawn on f4, which was immediately protected by white. I should point out though that it was probably not needed to play this move. More precise, in hindsight, here is this move, bishop d3, just developing your pieces as quickly as possible, with the point being that if you do take on f4, well, there is knight takes d5, you're attacking the queen, you're recapturing the pawn, and the knight cannot be taken because that hangs the bishop on c8. This is a good position for white. It was not played, as I said, the move g3 was played by Magnus, and after castling, only now he played the bishop to d3. Now, of course, he is attacking the pawn on h7, but here, another very interesting moment, because everybody is thinking here how to stop that threat of bishop takes h7. Black played here the move g6. He could also have gone for the move h6. But look what the engines are saying, that this move, bishop h3, this looks absolutely insane. Black can just bring the bishop out here to this square, preventing white from castling. But one point is that after bishop takes h7, the king goes to h8, white also got to do something about that threat of bishop g2 hitting both the knight and the rook. Now, if you would move the knight away, then Black does have time to play the move g6 and the bishop is trapped. You can still sacrifice the bishop, and after pawn takes, knight takes with check, you're forking the king and rook, the queen protects the knight, king g8, knight takes, bishop takes. This is a totally unclear position. We will never know what has happened, but it was a very interesting option for Black. Instead, g6 was played. Let's get back to the game, and white thinks, okay, this pawn on g6, I'm going to make use of that. He played here the move h4 with the plan of playing h5 next. And, well, if that happens, the h-file will come open, the rook starts to join the attack, and, well, Black has to think about what he's going to do against it. If you do play something like h5, later on you may get problems with your pawn on g6, with moves like f5 or maybe knight e5. Things are not looking that pleasant at all for Black. So Lazavik comes up with another idea, played here this move, knight a6, planning to get a knight to b4, trying to trade off that knight for the bishop on d3. But white can take on a6, ruining Black's pawn structure. This is a very interesting clash with a lot of imbalances. Knights versus bishops, weakened pawn structures for both sides. Let's see how this works out. White castled here, and black decides to get the bishop out to f5 to attack the queen. The queen goes away, and rook fe8 was played. Rook fe1 by white, and the bishop goes back to e8. So both sides have placed a rook on the open file. Likely pieces are going to be swapped at some point. But first, Magnus says, I want to put a knight on e5. That's my ideal square. And if I do get more time, I would like to play knight a4, knight c5. And here you see that the knights are about to take over. They are nicely supported by their own pawns. White has a huge grip on the center. So black is trying to fight back here with the move f6, questioning the knight. The knight goes back to d3. And what is black going to do with his bishop? He can take here on d3. But if you do so, then the queen is even attacking that weak pawn on a6. That's the main drawback of black's strategy. So taking the bishop for the knight is not a good idea, I think. So black just goes back with the queen to d7 so that the bishop covers the c5 square one more time. But the knight comes into a4. White gains control over that square. Bishop e4 played. Very interesting. The knight comes into c5 to attack the queen, but the queen goes to h3. Threatening checkmate. Of course, this was seen by both players. White captures the bishop. D takes e4, and now it's a new situation with a knight versus a bishop. Major pieces on the board. A lot of things can happen here. The question is, what should white do now? Apparently, this move, knight c3, is a good move. You want to get that knight back into the game, attacking the pawn on e4. But it was not played by Magnus, and I'm trying to understand why he didn't play this move. If you do protect that pawn with your queen, the queen will come to c2, and the pawn on e4 is 3 times attacked, only twice defended. Black has a problem here, so you cannot play queen f5. If you do play f5, well, this queen on h3 is just out of play. It cannot really go anywhere. One very good plan for white would here be to reroute that knight from c3 to d1 and then to e3. When you cover the g4 square, the knight is excellently placed. You're guarding your king side, and later on you will start targeting that pawn on c6. Also, black's king is quite open. I really like white's position, but Magnus played it in a slower way, and probably this is imprecise. He played queen c2, attacking both these pawns, but now the queen goes back to e6, defending both pawns. Now the difference is that if you do play knight c3, there is this move, f5. And the pawn is defended by the pawn on f5. So knight c3 no longer is that good. And here you see the big difference starting with knight c3. Let's see what happened. Rook ac1 played, attacking the pawn on c6, but black is not going to defend the pawn, but just counterattacks with the other rook, bringing it to d8. You're attacking the pawn on d4. So taking on c6 just initiate a lot of exchanges. That's not the way to play here. And white therefore decides to play here the move knight c5. Bishop takes, queen takes, and now queen takes a2. A lot of pawns are coming off the board. White takes on c6, black takes on b2. And here you have a choice. Are you going to take one of these pawns? But then the pawn on d4 is lost. If you want to keep that passed pawn on the board, maybe queen c4 with the idea that you give a check and later you can advance the pawn to d5 is an ambitious idea. But Magnus goes for this move. Queen takes f6, taking away a pawn in front of the black king. But there's queen takes d4, and black offers the exchange of queens. And if white moves the queen away, maybe e3 can be played at some point. So almost nothing remains on the board. White decides here to go for the exchange of queens. Queen takes d4, rook takes d4. So all of a sudden we have a rook endgame, but white's rook is very active. It goes after the pawn on a7. Rook d3, because the pawn cannot really be defended in an efficient manner. And with rook d3, the plan is very simple. That if you do take the pawn on a7, then e3 is going to be played. And let's say if everything is exchanged here, then you get this endgame where both sides have 3 pawns. That's going to be a very, very equal drawish endgame. So white, and this is typical Magnus style, guys. He wants to keep as much as play as possible in this position. He doesn't want to allow the exchange with the move e3. He played here this move, king g2. Now e3 can still be played, but look what Magnus does. Magnus put a rook on e2. I think this is an interesting idea, because you cannot take on f2 with check. The king is no longer on g1. If you do take on f2, it's of course rook takes e8. So black played here the move a5, and now it's rook takes a7. White is collecting pawns. But here black goes rook d2, forcing the exchange of one pair of rooks, because white cannot take on e3. It runs into rook takes e3, pawn on f2 is not allowed to take the rook on e3. So after rook d2, it's rook takes, pawn takes. Black is threatening to promote that d pawn, so the rook goes back to d7 to stop the pawn. Black cannot really support that pawn any longer. It runs into king f3 when the rook has to move and the pawn will be taken next. So a different plan by black is executed now. a4. Black is running with his pawn. White takes on d2 and the rook goes behind the passed pawn. That's where rooks belong. But as you can see, all of a sudden white is having one extra pawn, and it's gonna be a very interesting endgame. Let's have a look. King f3. White activates the king. Black pushes the pawn, so it's 2 squares away from queening that pawn. Rook needs to block. King f7. White activates the king. King e6. Black does the same, and white goes king d4. It's clear that the white king is on its way to pick up the pawn on a3. But the question is black in time to wrap up the remaining pawns on the other side of the board? King f5 with the idea to come in with the king. But now it's f3. Good move by Magnus. Black goes h6 and king c4. I think this is a very instructive moment, because what you need to understand is that white will pick up the pawn on a3. You cannot really do anything about it. But what do you want to do in the meantime as black? Well, I think Lazavik made a very impractical choice here, decision here, with the idea of exchanging pawns with the move g5. Normally, when you're down in material, you should really try to trade off as many pieces as possible. Exchanging pawns is a good idea. But here, just keeping pawns on the board. Let's say if you play a move like h5, white goes king b3, you give a check, you force white to take with the king. Now the king is really far away, but now the rook can come in with ideas to attack the pawn on f3 or g3. And I think this is relatively a very simple draw. Right? White cannot do much here. He can keep on playing, but likely you will lose one of these pawns and the white king is too far away. So Lazavik played g5. I will show you why this is so complicated for black. Pawn takes, all the pawns are coming off the board. King b4, rook b8, okay, king takes pawn. And now we have this endgame where white has 2 extra pawns, but the white king is still far away, like in the other line. But this is a very tricky table-based type of position, where the engine says immediately it's a win or a draw. But practically it's very difficult, and you need to know what you're doing. And I think the move played in the game is the decisive mistake, but it's not an obvious mistake. But let me try to explain what the key defensive idea here is for black. If you move the king to f5, how is white going to make progress? Let's say you want to get your king closer. If the king is on e3, white is winning. So the key move here for white is to play rook b2 and try to cross the b file very soon. But here you go rook g8. You're attacking this pawn. Now if you do play the move g4, you do get exactly what you want. Now the pawns are stopped by the king on f4. You have a very nice blockade and you can protect with your rook, but now the rook will come back to cut off the king, and this is a theoretical draw. I mean, it's not that simple, but it's also not easy for white to make progress. So that's a very important line. Let me show you one other idea. Instead of g4, if you do go rook b5 check, the king goes back to e6. That's a very clever move. The king had other squares to go back to, but this is the only right one. If you do play g4 to save your pawn, now it's rook f8. That's why the king has to be on e6 to attack the other pawn. Now if you go back with your rook, this is the only way to avoid the loss of that pawn on f3. Now the king will come back, come to f4, and later you will cut off the king, and it's going to be a theoretical draw once again. So that's the way to try to save the game. Now let's see what happened. Rook b1 played, rook c2, very good move. White is activating the rook. Black played rook f1, attacking the pawn, and now rook c3. The rook is protecting the pawns from the side, and white is just about to bring the king closer. Now, for instance, if black would play rook g1, which was not played, the key move here is rook c5 check. And now, after something like king f6, you put a pawn on g4, and next you can play this move, rook f5, and step by step you're untangling, because this is like a very nice construction, as the rook on f5 will protect the pawn on f3, pawn on f3 supports the pawn on g4, and the pawn on g4 covers the rook. That will make it easier for your rook to come closer. We will see the exact same mechanism in the game. Because black played here king f6. Now the king comes. Rook g1, g4. Rook f1, king c2. Just black is not putting up a lot of resistance. The king can just approach too easily. Now king g5. The king wants to come back. Having provoked white to play the move g4, the king wants to be on f4. But rook c5 check. That's the key move. Now the king comes to f4. Rook f5 check. And the king is not able to block the pawns in front of, with the king in front. So here you go g5. The pawn is really too strong. The king goes back. You play f4. And this is the typical self-propelling mechanism. That's how famous endgame trainer Mark Dvoretsky used to call it in his famous endgame books. Now after the move king e4, you have the move rook f6. And the white king is no longer needed to help the pawns advancing. Because after the move king d5, black actually resigned. There would follow the move g6. And if the rook goes away, you play f5. And if you attack the rook, you play rook f7. And you see that step by step, the pawns are just coming forward. And there's nothing black can do against the promotion of the one of these pawns. So only if you just give a bunch of checks, you walk with your king towards the rook, and the checks will be over soon. So that was definitely not an easy game for Magnus in the very first round, but that's what we get to see in the finals, guys. This is going to be a very interesting week with a lot of fighting chess. I'm very curious to see who is going home with these $200,000. Is it Magnus, Hikaru, or somebody else? Let me know in the comments what you think of this game. If you see some other interesting games you would like to get covered on this channel. And then very soon, more coverage of this exciting tournament.